Welcome, Phyllis Schachter. She is the author of Choosing to Die, A Personal Story, Elective Death by Voluntary Stopping Eating and Drinking in the Face of Degenerative Disease. Her husband decided to use voluntary stopping eating and drinking when he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. He didn't want to live into the late stages of Alzheimer's. He wanted to die on his own terms. Phyllis supported him through his decision and death, and she became expert in this form of elective death. This book is a first-hand personal account written about voluntary stopping, eating, and drinking. She shares about their love story and time together traveling through this journey, legal and medical preparations, what happened at the end of his life, and the transformative nature for her of this experience. Soon after his death in 2013, Phyllis began an educational mission about this elective choice. She did a TED Talk, not by choice. She developed an extensive website. Now she's written this book to help people with degenerative disease make life-affirming choices. Today, she is a leading spokesperson. She was the organizer and speaker at a first national conference on voluntary stopping eating and drinking, which was held here at Seattle University in 2016. She continues to use her skills as a business consultant, a public speaker, a teacher, as she continues to educate others about expanding our end-of-life choices. Please welcome author Phyllis Schachter.
Thank you and good afternoon. My life for meaning in my own life was radically affected 5 years ago when my husband died. Prior to that, he received a life-changing diagnosis, and I witnessed how the meaning in his life shifted dramatically. Both of our lives were transformed. I'm going to share this story with you. My life, to be sure, did have meaning before all of this occurred. I was happily married. I came from a family with a lot of love. I've always had a big community of friends. I've been well educated. I have a wonderful daughter and 2 grandchildren. And I worked in 2 meaningful careers, first as a teacher and then as a business consultant, with my husband for many years in a business that was very meaningful to both of us with great enjoyment and success. But through all those years and much of my life, there was a great fear that hovered and affected the quality of my life, my fear of death. As I will explain in detail, I can see now, in hindsight, that it was finding a way to overcome my fear of death that drove the meaning in my life. This is our story. My husband, Alan, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease toward the end of 2011. You can imagine how frightening and upsetting this was to both of us. We had to find a way to cope, to figure out what to do. And what we learned is that we did what most people do. We went into denial. We just got on with our lives. But as Alan's life began to change noticeably in disturbing ways, we knew we had to face what was occurring, and we dreaded this. Alan's mother and my father both had Alzheimer's. So we knew, we witnessed what it was like to live into the late stages of Alzheimer's, which is the fastest growing disease today. We visited the best dementia facility in our county. We actually had one of the best long-term care insurance policies that exists that would have taken care of him in this facility for 4 years. It was horrifying for both of us. And Alan became clear that he never wanted to live in such a facility. In a phone conversation with Trudy James when she was doing some volunteer chaplaincy work with End of Life Washington, she said, "Do you know about voluntary stopping eating and drinking?" I had never heard of it. She suggested I do some research. I did some legal research, and I found a long white paper by Thaddeus Pope and Lindsay Anderson. Mr. Pope is a health law professor and attorney. And I learned that VSED is a legal option and can be a form of elective death, and that with the proper planning, it can be peaceful and compassionate and loving. I shared the information with Alan, and after he read it, he came to me one day and he said, "I've read this information and I've made up my mind. This is what I'm going to do." This was terribly sad, and it was a great relief to Alan to have found a way to escape the horrible late stages of Alzheimer's. It was as if a great weight had been lifted from our shoulders. After Alan made his decision, for several months, frequently, I would go up to him and say, "Are you sure this is what you want to do?" And finally one day he came up to me and he said, "Please don't ask me anymore. I've made up my mind. This is what I'm going to do." This was the most difficult experience of my entire life. I couldn't find much information about VSED. I realized I would need to be my husband's advocate, and this became the single focus of my life, preparing everything I could so that Alan could have a good death and die on his terms. I had no one like myself, no Phyllis to turn to. I couldn't find anyone who had done this before. I researched and I learned about all the medical and legal considerations. And gradually, I put everything into place on his behalf. I made sure we had a loving doctor who agreed to oversee his dying process. And she gave him appropriate medication to keep him comfortable throughout the process. I found a good elder care attorney, and we filled out all the necessary documents. We updated his health directive. We filled out the Alzheimer's Advanced Mental Health Directive. And she wrote a document that took liability away from the caregivers, the doctor, and myself. Dr. Timothy Quill is a well-known palliative care doctor in this country. And I'm very grateful that he wrote the foreword to my book. And this is a little bit about what he said about elective death. Of all the last resort options for elective death, including physician-assisted death, voluntary euthanasia, palliative sedation, and stopping life-sustaining therapies, VSED is the least well-known or understood by the general public. One day, while we were still enjoying our life and our love together, Alan turned to me and said, "I think it's funny that people have their funerals after they die. You know, when they can't hear all that love and attention. I want to be at my own funeral." And so a few months before he died, while he could speak fairly well, we held a beautiful celebration of life. One of the most difficult situations for Alan was to pick a marker, to have a signal, to know when to start this process. He had to be mentally capable to recognize the marker and had to be mentally capable to follow through with the entire process. And He wanted to live as long as possible. He decided his marker would be when he had no longer had the energy to leave the house to go to our Center for Spiritual Living. He was done. We both were involved in this community, and this community provided a lot of support to us, and he had been a keyboard player for 7 years. And after that last visit, where we went there together, he came home and we sat down at the dining room table and he said, I can't leave the house anymore. I'm just too exhausted. It's time for me to start. And I agreed with him, with his decision and his timing. Alan and I shared freely with our friends and our family about his plan to VSED. We didn't hide this information. We knew we were paving the way for many others who would follow in our footsteps. But one of the biggest challenges was the unanticipated criticism that came our way. Some people actually asked, is Phyllis making Alan do this so she doesn't have to take care of him anymore? Someone even called Adult Protective Services. And on the third morning of his fast, we had a surprise knock at our door. There was a social worker there. She said somebody reported this. This was a real shock to us. But as I patiently showed her all of our elaborate preparations, and as she spoke with Alan and saw how calm and determined he was, she became educated about VSED. And she wrote a very positive report. Once Alan set the date and began his fast, I was in contact daily with our doctor, either by phone or house visits. It took Alan 9.5 days to die. And I go into detail about this in my book, about what occurred during each day of his dying process. In addition to the doctor, we also had caregivers 24 hours a day to support him through this process. And after he died, we had very beautiful and special rituals to mark his passing. In the months and days leading up to Alan's elective death, I watched his process closely, and I learned profound lessons about the search for meaning in one's life. In retrospect, I see that Alan searched for meaning during much of his life, like many of us do. His parents were very critical of him, and even though he was extremely successful and multi-talented, he had an underlying fear that he wasn't good enough and was doing things wrong. As Alan faced his death, he did the necessary internal work to let go of that fear as he moved into a deep, peaceful place of self-acceptance. It was astonishing to witness. Simultaneously, I watched his fear and his sadness about his illness transform into his victory in coming to profound peace with his decision. Death throws everything in life into new perspective. Alan was living more freely than I had ever seen before. He focused on love, forgiveness, gratitude as he approached his very conscious death. Throughout much of this process, it was as if we were both in a small boat and we couldn't see the shoreline anymore. Neither of us knew where we were going. Alan was actually curious about this journey. He went beyond conventional beliefs and he charted his own course. For some months, it was as if I were a student in a classroom, and I wrote down many of the things that he said. And a couple of months before he died, this is some of his exact words. I am comfortable and at ease with everything. I just feel great all the time, even when I'm tired. I'm present all the time. I'm happy all the time. I didn't feel this way most of my life. People notice how happy I look. I think that's important because I'm really at the end of this life. I'm sure it goes on. I was burdened by all the things that I thought I should be doing, and I'm not anymore. I love to help other people reduce their suffering. I don't know how to do that. For many years, one of Alan's favorite quotes was this: "A belief is just a story you tell yourself about what is. A belief is just a feeling of certainty about what is. A belief is not the truth." In preparation for his death, Alan was able to break through and transcend many of the beliefs that held him back during much of his life. I saw that Alan's desire to share his experience about letting go of old beliefs and fears that had plagued him was a strong passion in him. It gave his last months deep meaning. He had a deep desire to convey what he had learned, to help others feel this peace and freedom. The meaning of his life was clear to him, and I witnessed it. It was all about love, forgiveness, inner peace, and the release of burdens. He demonstrated that preparing to die could be a liberator for others if only they could understand this. As I witnessed the profound shift of what gave Alan's life meaning as he got closer to the VSED experience, I noticed that I too was going through my own deep and important shifts in my own life journey. As a result, my life has taken on entirely new meaning. 2 weeks before Alan began his fast, he was sitting at our breakfast table, and I was standing nearby in the kitchen, and I noticed he was crying. And I turned to him, and I said, "Honey, why are you crying? What are you feeling?" And he turned to me with tears rolling down his face, and he said, "I'm not afraid of dying. I have lived a good life. But I want everyone to know about VSED." And before I could think of the words coming out of my mouth, I spontaneously replied, "You'll just have to trust that I'll be your vehicle." I literally gasped. I remembered that. I knew what just occurred was profound, yet I didn't yet know the depth of our words. The trajectory of my life was forever changed. From a place of choice and knowing, his request became a mission in my life and added deep meaning to my life. I was deeply affected by the entire process and was eager to share this new information with others, everything from the technical aspects of VSED as an end-of-life option to the meaningful spiritual transformation that had occurred for both of us. I had a strong calling, a fervent mission. First, I gave my TEDx talk called Not Here by Choice. I gave this only 7 months after he died, when I was in a deep state of grief. You can find this on YouTube. It's also on the homepage of my website, PhyllisShacter.com. My website is the most complete information on the internet today about voluntary stopping eating and drinking. And through my website, people contact me from all over the world. I speak at conferences and was interviewed on the radio and podcasts and for journals, and I continue to do this. And then finally, I wrote my book, Choosing to Die, and it was published last April. I've become part of a growing movement of awareness about expanding end-of-life options. This has given my life great meaning and passion. I see how this body of knowledge can radically alleviate anxiety for people and their families. And more people are creating the proper legal and medical documents to support their decisions. And more people are aware of how important it is to talk to your doctor years in advance before you think you're going to die, and to make sure that your doctor will follow through with your requests. Otherwise, get a new doctor. But there's an even more profound and extraordinary way in which my life has acquired new meaning. My fear of death, that for so long weighed heavily on my life and limited my freedom, has vanished. Death always felt like annihilation and suffocation to me. Death was the fear that was under all my fears and anxieties. My willingness to experience my fear of death and my grief fully is precisely what allowed me to finally be free of it. I didn't try to cover up any of the pain. I knew that the only way out of the fear and the grief was to go all the way through it, and I've done that. And it took me a long time. I devoted the last chapter of my book about this process, my grieving process, and how I moved through it, and how I found a great deal of joy and meaning in my life again. That's my favorite chapter of the book. The unexpected gift is my acceptance and knowing that I'm going to die, and I'm okay with this. This knowledge is Alan's most important legacy to me. To live without the underlying fear of death is like being a bird in flight. I am free. Death isn't my enemy. I'm my own enemy if I deny death. Because by denying death, I'm denying life. Life, death, they are on a continuum. Life and death are twins. Grief, renewal, and hope go hand in hand. Right now, am I living or am I dying? We don't have conscious dying without conscious living. The poet Rilke said, to paraphrase, that death is not the scissors that cut off the rope of life at the end. Death is one of the strands woven into the rope of life. I'm an advocate for expanding end-of-life choices. I'm an advocate for living into our dying, being aware of what it is happening, when it's happening, and not denying it. I'm an advocate for preparing to die well. Writing my book has helped me complete the most important chapter of my life. I'm learning to live and love in new ways. I'm learning to find new personal inner freedom. I've overcome my own fear of death, and I have the opportunity to serve countless others, most of whom I will never know about or meet. I'm okay if I die tomorrow. And yet, I'd really love to grow old and become this very wise old viper. I'd like to close with a unique 2-minute version of this story. And honestly, these words came through me spontaneously. One day I was sitting at my desk preparing for my book release celebration, and it was, in 1 minute, all these words came through me. This is unique. This is not my style. I don't know where it came from, and I'm going to present it to you. My man, where did he go? I thought I lost him some years ago, but he's really right here, attending this show. My man, some years ago he was so sick and dying, and I couldn't stop crying. They said he died, and then I cried, but where did he go? He's really right here, attending this show. I lost my man, I couldn't stop crying. His brain got small, but his being was tall. He said he had to leave this plane because things don't remain the same. He said, don't give me no food, don't give me no drink. I've only been living on the brink, and soon I'll be going out with a wink. Then they said, he died. But where did he go? He's really right here, attending this show. He said, tell him what I did, how I could no longer live on this grid. Share our story and all our glory. Show them this book. Have them read this book. Feel our love. Know our story. Open your mind and feel the glory. Now I'm no longer crying, though the grief was long. Now I can sing this song, 'cause I know where I now belong. With you, and you, and you, and us. I wrote a book, So take a good look. I wrote a book. So take a good look. We wrote a book. Thank you very much. Assure you, my husband heard every word.
We have time for a question or two, so
Yeah, we do.
Please go ahead.
I had a question about how important it is to have a physician have medicine available to keep suffering at a minimum.
It's critical, it's essential to have good medical support and caregiving support, including medication. And it is legal to be fairly well drugged throughout this process. My husband wanted to be as conscious as possible, but the relationship between the patient and the doctor is confidential, and he could have requested to be pretty sleepy throughout the whole thing. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much for coming, and I'm looking forward to doing a book signing, and it is my deepest pleasure to be doing this here.